Hi, I'm here today with Professor Tim Lenton, who is a founder of the Global Systems Institute and chairing climate change and earth system science at the University of Exeter. He's got more than 25 years of research experience, focused on modelling life's coupling to the earth system, biogeochemical cycling, climate dynamics, and associated tipping points. Tim also co-authored Planetary Boundaries and is in the top 100 of Reuters' hot list of world's top climate scientists. So hi, Tim. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for inviting me along.
So I know we're a bit short of time, so I'm just going to add your presentation on here. And then I'm going to leave you to it. So we're going to find out about positive tipping points today, which is going to be fascinating. So away you go, Tim.
Yes, positive tipping points to avoid some bad climate tipping points is what I want to talk about. So we'll start with the sort of scarier stuff and then get to the more cheerful stuff. But before we do any of that, I'm just going to show you a little movie of a system that I'm forcing towards a tipping point. So this is a system, could be any complex system, bit of the climate, maybe society or the economy. It's got two different stable states. They're the two valleys that you see, and the one that the system started in, the blue ball rolling around, is over time losing stability. And at some point, that means it's going to tip into the other state in an abrupt and hard to reverse manner. There we go, as the ball turned red. And what's happening there is the initial state of the system, which started off nice and stable there, is losing stability over time because of the pressure I'm putting on that system. And that includes giving some telltale early warning signals that the tipping point might be coming, because we see the system fluctuate more and slow down in its recovery from those fluctuations before we get to a big tipping point, where essentially some strongly amplifying feedbacks, we call them, within the system are propelling the abrupt change that you've just seen again. So over the last 20 years, I've been busy trying to identify which bits of the climate system could exhibit tipping point change like that due to our activities collectively, global warming essentially. And here's a little potted summary of some of those systems and some of the evidence for accelerating change in an alarming direction in those systems. We don't need to go through all of them to see that we're in trouble already. We've got accelerating loss of ice from the ice sheets in Greenland and West Antarctica, and indeed evidence that the West Antarctic ice sheet is already at or past a tipping point. And if both of those ice sheets are tipped, then eventually it'll lead to at least 10 meters of global sea level rise and redraw the coastlines of the world. There's also, in the middle of the diagram, the slowing down of the great overturning circulation of the Atlantic Ocean. That's a major tipping point if it were to occur. And evidence of loss of stability of the Amazon rainforest, that great cradle of biodiversity, and so on. So that's just what we see in observations. And combined with what our models project or predict for the future, we're able to pull together a kind of summary of how close are various systems to a tipping point. And you can see arrayed along the bottom here that there's quite a lot of systems that we think could pass the tipping point, including those two ice sheets that I started with, but including bits of the biosphere and aspects of the circulation of the ocean and atmosphere. And in each case here, we're summarizing with these what we call burning embers, a kind of uncertainty about where the tipping point is for each system. And our best guess is a dotted line as a function of global warming level and the current warming levels indicated there. And you see that already we've got 4 major climate tipping points at risk, including those 2 big ice sheets. And at the level of warming that current policies worldwide are taking us to, which is about 2.7 degrees centigrade, we think that there are 13 systems at risk of a tipping point, and we'd be pretty sure that 3 of them would have long since passed a tipping point, including like low latitude coral reefs, which 500 million people depend on for their livelihoods. So this is a big deal, and this is one of the biggest risks of climate change. And unfortunately, these tipping points don't act in isolation. It's like if you tip one thing, it can make tipping another more or less likely. But unfortunately, in the case sketched out here, tipping one thing tends to make tipping another more likely. So that includes the fact that the Arctic's warming at an alarming rate, about 3 times as fast as the global average, because a big white reflective sea ice surface is melting away and being replaced by a dark ocean that absorbs loads more sunlight. So that heats up the Arctic. That's one of the big reasons the Greenland ice sheet's melting away. That in itself pours fresh water into the Atlantic Ocean. But also, warmer Arctic means more rain and snowfall, which is also fresh water coming out of the sky and into the Atlantic Ocean, and that's a big issue. That freshwater forcing is the thing that's weakening the great overturning of circulation of the Atlantic. And as that's slowing down, it affects the monsoons around the tropics, including in the Amazon, West Africa, India, and it leaves heat behind in the Southern Ocean, threatening the ice sheets down there. So unfortunately, it's coupled together the climate system, in a way that you could have cascading tipping points rattling through the system. So lots of reasons to want to accelerate change to limit global warming. And we can think about that challenge of decarbonising the global economy and the fact that we need to do it a lot faster than we are, about 5 times faster than we are globally. We can think about that also as a tipping point challenge. In this case, I describe it as a positive tipping point that we need to get out of a business usual state of the economy powered by fossil fuels and into this other decarbonised state of the economy. If we're going to be able to do that, it's going to be all about finding and triggering some reinforcing feedbacks of positive change that can kind of lower the hilltop here and tip the system. And so I want to show you some evidence that there are these positive tipping points. They've already started to happen at national scales, and they could be our savior, because only when we get that kind of self-propelling, amplifying change could we hope to speed up our action on climate change to the level necessary. So I'll start though with a historical example that there have been major changes in social norms. I'm not sure you recognize the family resemblance here, but this is a distant relative of mine, Philip Lenton, photographed in the year 1913. If you know your social history and you can see the number on her jacket, you might be able to guess that why she's in prison, hence the number on the jacket, is because she was one of the suffragettes in prison at the time because she was implicated in an arson attack that burned down the tea house in Kew Gardens in London. Whilst on hunger strike, Lillian was force-fed, like many of the suffragettes. But unfortunately, they put the tube down the wrong way into her lungs rather than her stomach. And that's effectively, when you pour the liquid food in, like being drowned. So she was nearly killed. She was rushed to hospital. The government covered up and said that she was in hospital because of the hunger strike. It became obvious very quickly that that was a lie, and that's one of many events that turned public opinion against the then government and in favour of votes for women, which were first granted at least to women over the age of 30 in 1918. And that represents, when the vote was granted to women over the age of 18 and probably a decade later, that represents a major change in our social democracy that a very few brave people fought for and managed to change rights for half of all people. So profound social change, relatively fast. And we see examples of courageous individuals starting profound social change on the climate issue. Greta Thunberg here being an obvious example. Her school strike for climate that she started as a solo protester made it incrementally easier for the next person to join her, to skip school, join her protest, who made it incrementally easier for the next person, and so on and so on. And within months, you had mass protests of millions of people on the streets of major cities in the world, protesting for more decisive policy action on climate change. And governments, or in this case, in the picture, the European Parliament, soon followed and declared climate emergencies. So this is a classic case of amplifying feedback and social change. certainly leading to change in political rhetoric. But as Greta would remind us, that's all just blah, 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 unless you're actually changing behaviors and technologies in a way that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, because that's the only thing the climate can feel or hear. So we need to have a look at some other examples to see that it's possible for us humans to change technology and behavior quickly, because we definitely need to tackle the climate crisis. And so a historical classic example of rapid change in society and technology would be illustrated here with I'm going to show you two photos, but this first photograph is Fifth Avenue, New York City in the year 1900, and the challenge is to spot the one person in an automobile when everybody else is in a horse-drawn carriage. And if you've got your eye in, you'll have seen them in sort of coming towards us on the right-hand side of the street there. But if we have a look at a photograph taken 13 years later of the same Easter parade in Fifth Avenue, New York City, just in 1913, you've got the opposite challenge, which is to spot the one person in a horse-drawn carriage when everybody else is in an automobile. So they are actually on the same side of the street coming towards us over there. The point is, this is a major tipping point in personal transport that unfolded across US cities in the space of a decade and continued to spread around the world pretty rapidly ever since. And interestingly, in the middle of that transition, there was a moment or a time when about nearly a third of the early cars were battery electric. But of course, the internal combustion engine and the Model T Ford kind of won out, and the rest is sort of history. But as we'll see, electric vehicles are finally making their way back in. And they are the basis of a fresh tipping point in personal mobility that's already happened in at least one country, thanks to these characters here. So these are, as it says, members of the pop band a-ha, including the famous lead singer Morten Harket here, photographed in 1989, along with Harald in the middle here, who's an architecture professor in Stavanger in Norway, and Frederick, who I think is the character here, who's an environmentalist. And the car behind them that they've bought and are going to drive back to Norway is an early hobby converted electric vehicle. And it would be what we call a Fiat Panda in England. But the point is, this group had a vision to try to get Norway to a cleaner economy, including zero emissions vehicles, electric vehicles, solar power, energy efficient homes, and the works. And they had a plan. They knew that the media would be following this pop band around wherever they went, and therefore they would go and obtain this electric car and bring it back to Norway with a bunch of demands to the Norwegian government to incentivize electric vehicles. And they knew they'd have the media shining a light on that message. So they demanded that the import registration tax be waived for electric vehicles in Norway. And not just this one vehicle, but every electric vehicle ever since. And that's a big deal because it's about 25% of the value of the vehicle. And they got that demand that year, in fact. But they also demanded that road tolls be removed for all electric vehicles. That took about an 8-year fight to get the government to cave in on that, but eventually they did. These are things that what I would call create enabling conditions for a tipping point to electric vehicles, which has unfolded in Norway in the last decade or so. Electric vehicle market share has gone from about 1% a decade ago to over 80% as of 2022 in Norway, and the streets of Oslo look kind of like this. And if you look at the data, well, you kind of see that transition. So sort of 1% sales in maybe 2010 of battery electric vehicles. They were at 54% in 2020. As I've just said, they were up to 80% in 2022. And that's also because of a bunch of reinforcing feedbacks where people who own those vehicles started to talking to other people about how good they were, etc., and the whole thing spread. And that's not just a parochial example. It's important for thinking globally, because road transport is about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and there's the potential for a global electric vehicle tipping point on the roads. And that's because of a really strong reinforcing feedback, whereby the more batteries you make and the more electric vehicles you make to use those batteries, the cheaper the next battery gets to manufacture. And that's what this little plot shows, that batteries have come down in price a factor of 10 over a decade as the market for electric vehicles has expanded. And what the Norway case shows is if you have a bit of, well, social activism or smart policies that support electric vehicles to be consumed, you can trigger the tipping point to electric vehicles. And once that gets going, the whole thing is going to be self-amplifying, because the more electric vehicles that get bought, the cheaper the next one gets to make and to buy, because of these economies of scale with the batteries. And that means the electric vehicle tipping point is already spreading across Europe and around the world, and is interesting and important in its own right, but triggers other possible changes, like having lots of cheap batteries can enable electrifying goods transport, at least light goods transport. It's the thing that's going to persuade oil companies to stop being oil companies when they realize they're sat on a lot of stranded asset, basically oil they're not going to be able to sell, because we're not going to need it to drive around in electric cars. And finally, having lots of cheap batteries available in the economy is a big enabler for the even bigger tipping point to renewable energy, because cheap batteries can help balance supply of renewable electricity and demand for electricity. So it's like when you want to boil the kettle isn't always when the sun's shining or the wind's blowing, so you need some cheap storage in the grid. That brings me on to my second example of positive tipping point that's happened in the UK. And it's for the shutting of coal burning out of power generation. So the coal burning is the black line here, and this is the y-axis is its contribution to UK electricity consumption. And in 2012, at this peak here, 40% of our power came from burning coal. Nowadays, it's down at 1% or less, and renewables have taken up most of the slack in the UK. And that was triggered by just a modest price on carbon emissions in the power sector in the UK that basically began to make coal burning unprofitable for those invested in it, which caused people to pull their money out of coal burning. And then that caused the utility companies who ran the big power stations to mothball and destroy the power stations, like this one in Didcot in Oxfordshire. So we get from a seemingly small carbon price on power generation to a kind of irreversible tipping point change in our energy system in the UK. And the good news again is that the revolution in power supply, if you like, and energy is spreading worldwide, again because of economies of scale, because the more wind turbines, or in this case on this graph, solar panels that we make, the cheaper the next one gets to make. And in fact, solar panels and onshore wind turbines have gone down in price about a factor of 10 in just the last decade. And they're going to continue to get cheaper. And they're already now producing power cheaper than fossil fuels in most of the world. By the end of the decade, they might be producing power at a quarter of the price of fossil fuels. So there's an energy revolution upon us. And it was apparent even a couple of years ago in this graph or plot of the world, which shows cheapest form of energy generation by country: blue for wind, yellow for solar, grey or black for fossil fuels. And you see already for much of the world, renewables have been cheapest for a few years. So that's a huge, huge change that's coming. And we've been looking ahead and trying to map out, well, on top of those observed tipping points or ones that are underway, what other tipping points could there be in transforming the whole economy to a zero greenhouse gas emission state, so-called net zero. And without going into all the details, we're able to identify not just particular tipping points in particular sectors like power that I talked about and light road transport, but we can also identify reinforcing feedbacks between sectors. So I said how cheaper batteries enable renewable energy, but the fact that renewable energy is getting really, really cheap, it enables the transition to electrified transport, because your fuel costs are dropping all the time if you opt for electric transport. But we've also mapped out, how we'll be able to enter a future where we use renewable electricity to make green hydrogen and green ammonia fuels to use in a bunch of sectors, and how, as each sector opens up, you get learning within that sector that brings down the price of the sustainable alternative. So we see the potential for what we call positive tipping point cascades through the economy to try and reduce the risk, shall we say, of those bad climate tipping point cascades that I started with. So from all of that, you might think, well, what can I do? Well, I'm trying to tell you that we've all got some part to play in this, and we've all got some agency to create positive tipping point change. We don't have to be like Lillian Lenton, my relative, and put our lives on the line on hunger strike in prison to make a big difference. Because now we can make a difference. Well, we can make a difference just by being consumers, choosing to behave differently or consume a different, more sustainable technology. But maybe in our workplaces and our businesses, we could also make businesses examples of leaders of change and reap the benefits, reputational and often profit-wise, of being leaders of change, being first movers. And probably the most effective change history would teach is going to come from a kind of coalition of all of us as members of society, with some supportive policy regimes, and we've heard a bit about those, with some shifting of finance towards the green solutions, we've heard a bit about that, with the media helping tell stories, and hopefully your sector as well playing a key role in communicating and reinforcing these messages. So to summarize, I've told you that I'm afraid we are in a climate emergency, and we're already in a situation where we've probably passed some damaging climate tipping points, and we're approaching some other ones. So limiting global warming to the internationally agreed target of well below 2 degrees C now requires some positive tipping points to accelerate transformative social change. And I've tried to show you that there are some examples of those already happening, thanks to some really visionary individuals and all of us participating, whether we know it or not, in those changes. And that should give us all back some sense of power in the face of an otherwise daunting problem of global climate change, because we can all be a bit of a part of triggering positive tipping points. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Tim. That was really interesting. I guess I'd had we talked earlier in the conference to Professor Colin Davis about climate apathy. And I think one of the things he was talking about there was about giving people a sense of something they can actually do. So as well as kind of understanding it, people have got to think of things they can actually do. So I wondered if there were any things that you'd identified maybe within our industry as individuals that we can do. Like particularly, we've seen a lot of theme parks going over like using solar panels and different forms of green energy. Is that like what would be the biggest wins, I suppose, that people can?
Well, as individuals, biggest wins could indeed be reducing energy consumption, switching to renewable energy, and reducing meat eating in simple terms. And that holds through to your sector and to industries, right? So you correctly identify, solar panels is a good thing, but also what are you serving or offering in the cafe? Are you offering any signals or stimuli to stop wasting the planet, eating way too much meat that's bad for our health and bad for the climate? I'm not saying no meat, I'm saying we eat far too much of the stuff. It's really bad for our health, it's bad for the planet, it's bad all round. Leadership has to come in public settings, and there are many and subtle ways in which you can influence consumer behavior within your attractions. So that'd be an obvious target for me, and one that could be true to your stated goals. Let's say you're a zoo and you're deeply committed to conservation action. It would be mad to be promoting meat consumption in your zoo if that's the case, because you'll be actively promoting and contributing to the problem you say that you're trying to tackle. So the same could be said for climate change. I mean, that's the next biggest. Habitat change is the biggest threat to species, that climate change is racing up to match it and beat it as the biggest vector species. So it's just common sense in my head, but basically wildly inconsistent to not be like acting as a thing, as a zoo or whatever, consistent with your stated goals, which is presumably conservation of wildlife and nature. So there's a concrete example, and put in fairly simple terms. But I would say more broadly, we're talking about a sector here that is capturing the public's imagination, hopefully, if it's doing its job well. And what I tried to give you is some stories that hopefully begin to capture the imagination of how we've all got some agency, we can all be a part of the change that we desperately need. And it's not a story of privation and misery, it's actually a story of better health, better technologies, better lives. But we need, the media, for example, and sort of the media and visitor experiences to tell those stories. People are not going to kind of get this from a lot of conventional media. There's a gross shortage of the clear, actionable, kind of positive, good news stories that I'm trying to tell here, and you can help with that.
Definitely, I think that's quite interesting. We talked to another presenter we had is Håkon Lund from Lundgruppen in Norway, and he was saying about the rise of electric vehicles, and they've put some solar panels in. And I think just thinking about that, the other thing that I think maybe we need to do, like you say, is when we do take these kind of actions, we also need to inform our visitors, but not in a way that's kind of, sort of dampening any fun, but just kind of part of the role is also to start talking about what we can all do, isn't it? And kind of,
yeah, I mean, fun has different definitions for different people, but I would have said that the task of like transforming the whole economy, how we live and how we relate to nature is a lot of fun, because we have to make like new coalitions with each other and get to know each other and try new things and experiment and so on and so forth. So it's a much more active and, in that sense, fun kind of learning experience than just trying to maintain the status quo and waiting for the climate ecological catastrophe to arrive on our doorstep, as it already is doing for some of the less well-off people in this world. So, we each have our own definition of fun, but for me, there's a lot of fun to be had in the transition, and there's not a lot of fun to be had in waiting for another sweltering heat wave to come and shut down the attraction or just make us all feel miserable. Or I could give you any number of other examples of unfun things that are starting to hit us. Well, suffice to say, a global pandemic a couple of years ago, that the roots of which are somehow tied up in our broken relationship with nature and our sort of exploitation of nature and so on and so forth.
Absolutely, and that's something I hadn't realised until recently, that actually sort of pandemics are also kind of another sort of outcome of global warming as well. I hadn't connected.
There's an effect from global warming in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's a credible case to be made that the virus jumps from in the wet market in Wuhan, jumps from a sort of caged, probably bat species or something like that, into a human host. But, that jumping event doesn't happen without the wet market and the appalling conditions that the wild animals are being trapped in that setting, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. So I think in our sort of, this is wrapping up a conference, but our sort of final message is really that in many ways, I think we want to be, I guess, communicating and talking about what we're doing as well. I think sometimes it's seen as probably not very cool and not very and something that's not going to do our businesses any good, going greener. But I think hopefully that's not the case, is it? I think we can see.
I mean, we can sit on our hands and say it's nothing to do with me and it's nothing to do with my business and blah blah blah. But I'm afraid it's in all of our interests to tackle the climate and ecological crisis that's starting to hurt us already, but also to embrace creating a better future together. This isn't about privation or backward steps or anything of the like. This is about getting to a better place where we've got more contact with and positive experience with nature, where we're not creating dirty, air polluted, rubbishy cities to live in that are affecting our health and life expectancy. So it's creating a better environment on lots of layers and levels. And it's about refinding a proper sense of well-being, because you don't have to be a genius to work out that increasing global GDP or economic consumption or those crude measures are not a faithful measure of what makes us happy, and instead are really just driving us towards an increasingly socially unequal world, where the many have-nots are getting understandably more and more upset with the few increasingly excessively rich individuals nominally running the show. So we've seen all of our shared interest to have some fun working together to create a better future.
Fantastic. I think I'll leave it there, Tim, but thanks very much for that. It's really, really interesting, and I'm sure our audience will be fascinated by it.
I hope so. Thanks, Rachel.